Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Simons. I'm the Director of Policy here at the Varkey Foundation, and I'm so unimportant that I'm moderating myself. What I'm going to do for the next 45 minutes or so is talk you through a large-scale survey which the Foundation has just released, which hopefully you may have seen a little bit of in the newspapers in the last week or two, but I want to give you a run-through of the main headlines from a very large survey we did of what parents think about their children's education. You'll be delighted to know that in the style of all the best conference presentations, I have at least 65 slides. I will inevitably run over time, so I'll skip through some of them. But I'll just try and give you some of the highlights of what we think some really, really interesting findings are from the survey, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So, a little note on the methodology. So we interviewed, or Ipsos Mori interviewed on our behalf, just over 27,000 parents across 29 countries around the world on an online basis around the turn of the year. And when we looked at this, we deliberately tried to find a group of countries that were representative of the world as a whole. So we looked at countries that are geographically split, we looked at large countries, smaller countries, high and low PISA performers, fast improving countries, less and more developed economies, to really get a sense of not just what certain parents think, but what we think the whole parents look like. And you can see the countries there. The little asterisks reflect the fact that we had a smaller sample size in those countries. So if anyone has any questions about how we did it, that means that the answers were weighted ever so slightly more heavily because the panel size in Uganda and Kenya and Estonia was slightly smaller. And we asked parents around 20 questions in total along the following 4 themes. The first thing we asked them was about what they thought about the quality of education that their child receives, and separately the quality of education which I think all other children receive in their country. Secondly, we asked a series of questions around helping children with their schoolwork out of school and how much parents got involved in their children's education. The third set of questions we asked was around their views on how education should be financed and funded, and in particular, did parents have views on who runs schools in their country? And the fourth thing we asked them was the theme of this year's GSF conference about what they think the world looks like in 2030. So let me just run through some of the headlines. And actually, what I'm going to try and do, can I have the other mic? I'll move around a bit more rather than stand behind the platform. Thanks very much. So you can see here this graph. This is the graph where we asked parents what they thought about the quality of teaching at their child's current school. And you can see there the global average, 78% of parents think that their child gets a good quality of education at their school. And you can see that with the possible exception of Uganda, it's pretty consistent that almost every parent thinks that their child gets a very, very good education in their school. Interestingly, on the right-hand side there, you can see, and I acknowledge this is a flawed proxy, you can see the PISA scores for that country in 2015, and you can actually see there's not much of a correlation between the quality of education which parents think their child is getting and the empirical quality of that country's education system. If you look then, when you break down that data, and we asked, well, how would you rate the quality of teaching at your child's school, whether they go to primary or secondary school? In the majority of countries, primary schools rate more highly. So parents are more likely in most countries in the world to think the quality of education they get at primary school is better than it is at secondary school. But not in every country. You can see there at the bottom there, in the bottom half a dozen countries, people think the secondary schools were stronger. And then we asked, we split out parents between those that go to fee-paying schools and those that go to state-funded schools. And it's an important definitional point here on fee-paying schools. We didn't distinguish between low-cost private schools and more kind of high-cost and elite private schools. So it's slightly skewed by the fact that you can see there in Uganda, for example, where a large proportion of children do go to low-cost private schools, similarly in South Africa, similarly in Turkey, similarly to a lesser extent in places like Mexico and Brazil. So it's important to note that not all parents are thinking the same thing about private education when they send their children to what can be very low-cost private schools. But you can see there that in the majority of countries, parents think that if their child is going to a fee-paying school, they think the quality of education they're getting is better. Again, we can have a discussion about whether that's empirically true or whether parents are more likely to think it's true because in some sense they've made an active choice to choose that school and therefore want to believe that the quality of education their child's getting is better. And I should say we don't know the answers to those questions. We didn't do qualitative follow-up with our parent sample, so all we can do is speculate as to why they may say that. Then we moved on from saying, okay, that's your child's school. What about the general schools in your country? And here we restricted it only to government free-to-attend schools. And you can see there that the global average is still positive. So by 45 to 24, parents think that all schools in their country of residence is good. but it's considerably less for almost every single country than it is for their child's school. And this is a relatively common finding in social sciences. When you ask people their experience of a public service, they will tend to say it's good, and then you ask them for their experience of that public service in general, and they will tend to say it's worse. Again, we can question about whether that's drawn from experience, or whether that's drawn from media reporting, or whether it's drawn from friends and families' experiences, but it's not uncommon. And again, that's what we found here in the survey. Interestingly, here we do see a little bit more of a correlation coming up with the PISA scores. So Finland, Estonia, Singapore, Canada, Australia, all very, very high PISA performers, and parents there, possibly reflecting what they are told is the quality of their country's education system, are reporting, on the whole, it's very good. Again, when you start to break down quality of all schools in your country, again, you see primary schools tending to score higher than secondary schools in most countries. And again, when we look at we are asking parents here of just about free to attend schools, but we are asking parents who go to private schools what they think about the quality of free to attend schools. Now, interestingly, here the free to attend schools start to score higher. So actually here, the percentage of parents who are going to free to attend schools are rating the quality of education in their country system higher than those who are at private schools. Again, you might think that's probably logical, because if you're opting out of the free to attend system into the private school system, you are maybe doing so because, at least in part, you don't believe that the free to attend system is a good one. So that you might expect that finding to have. But again, it's pretty stark there that at the top there's a big, big difference between parents who are going to private schools but nevertheless thinking that those free to attend schools are stronger. Then we asked a question which reflected the fact that, as we're all very, very familiar, the last decade has seen an absolute rush of global education reform. And we've seen billions, if not trillions, worth of donor money, philanthropic money, corporate money flowing into education. We've seen floods of legislation. We've seen a huge expansion of primary basic education, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa. We've seen massive increases in the number of children going to school, not necessarily learning that much, but a massive increase in the number of children going to school. And we said to parents, do you think any of it's made a blind bit of difference? And basically the answer is no. Which is a really cheery finding for us all here as we work in international education. But essentially, parents are split almost 50-50. Do you think that education has got better or worse in your country over the last 10 years? And the global average is about the same. Now, what's interesting, though, within that is that hides, as you can see there on the chart, a massive, massive discrepancy between some countries who have invested a huge amount in education and the parents are reporting it very, very positively. So in India, in China, in Indonesia, in Kenya, in places where you have seen a huge expansion of basic provision, where you have seen the start to roll out of universal primary education, you are seeing a really, really big uptick of parents reporting very, very high satisfaction levels with the direction of change. So that's an interesting finding. The other interesting finding about this, though, is actually whether we think this is, again, do we think this is true? Do we think that it is true that the Indian education system, to take an example at the top there, has got radically better in the last 10 years? Because there's a lot of empirical survey data when we actually model the answers, when we model the level of knowledge that is learned by third grade and fifth grade Indian students, actually we find there's been almost no change in the last 10 years. So lots and lots of reform has happened. On the whole, parents are pretty average. In some countries, they think it's doing massively better, but in countries where they think it is doing massively better, it doesn't always actually correlate with what other data tells us. So I think what this shows us here is really the complexities of trying to unpick what parents are making judgments on, because they're an important constituency for politicians and they're an important constituency for policymakers, but actually trying to get under the skin of why it is that has global education reform delivered a step change over the last 10 years. Most people in this room, I think, who work in this area professionally would say no. Would say that we've had a massive expansion of access, but actually we're still in the middle of a learning crisis. We still have large numbers, hundreds of millions of children in school but not learning. And I think most people would say that despite the huge investment of philanthropic and aid dollars over the last 10 years, we haven't yet made the step change necessary to see that. And we can all debate for hours and hours at conferences such as this why that might be. But it's interesting actually that parents, on the whole, think that it hasn't worked, but in some countries they're very, very positive about it. And you can just see this just breaks it down a little bit more, the percentages. And again, there's some staggeringly high percentages here at the top end of parents that really think they have made some significant improvements. Interestingly, and this is a common theme for actually quite a lot of our answers, if you look at the bottom, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain, United Kingdom, European parents are incredibly pessimistic. And we'll pick that up as a theme, actually, as we go more through this survey. Latin American parents and Asian parents that we survey tend to be much more optimistic. European parents, particularly what you might call old Europe, Western Europe and Central Europe, incredibly pessimistic about education systems. And this just breaks it down a little bit by age. Again, this is a relatively common finding that you find in public policy, where older parents tend to be much more pessimistic. So here you can see if you're a parent aged between 18 and 34, you're much more optimistic about what's happened in the last 10 years. And if you're age 45 or more, you're much more pessimistic. And again, we'll come back to this age distinction, because when we get onto who runs schools, it's very, very interesting to see the age discrepancy. Let's skip through that one. We asked about what parents would spend additional money on. And pleasingly, for a foundation that focuses on teachers, parents said teachers. Which was good, because it meant we didn't have to rerun the question. But what it does show is that actually parents do recognise that it is the teachers that make the school. And actually, despite all the fuss about 2030, despite all the fuss about the march of educational technology, actually, when it comes down to it, more parents want to see more teachers in classrooms than they want to see anything else. And again, you see the split here by those who would spend additional money on teachers. Again, look at what's interesting here, is that if you were thinking internationally, I'm not sure that Germany, United Kingdom, United States, France, and Australia would actually be the top countries where, empirically, you would say more money would need to be invested in teachers. Actually, I would say Indonesia, Mexico, not South Korea so much, Peru, Vietnam, Malaysia, actually maybe are countries where you'd expect to see more investment. And so it's interesting, again, if you look at the kind of the comparison to PISA there as a sort of flawed proxy of empirical quality of a system, actually in some countries where the teachers are doing relatively well, they're relatively well paid, the teacher shortages are relatively less, you actually see more parents saying they would put more money in teachers. In the systems that have the fewest teachers or the lowest paid teachers are also the least likely to say that they would invest more money in their teachers. Okay, so on to the second theme then, time helping with their children's education. We asked parents how often they spent helping their children academically with their education per week. And you can see here that the global average in the middle there is around 45% of parents spend about 4 hours or more a week, and a quarter of parents spend 7 hours a week or 1 hour a day. You can see at the top there an incredible 62% of Indian parents saying or claiming to spend an hour a day helping their children with their education. Again, look at what's at the bottom. Big, traditional, heavy-hitting systems. The PISA correlation here is very, very interesting. A lot of the top-performing PISA countries there, right at the bottom. Now, you might say that's logical, because actually, if logically you think your child's school is a good school and is helping them, you might conclude that it's not rational for you to spend your time helping your children with education. Actually, it might be that in China and Mexico and Indonesia, they recognize that they're trying to compensate for the defaults in the school system. But it's also interesting, I think, if you really do think that parents are behaving that rationally, I personally think that's slightly implausible. And it's therefore interesting, isn't it, that actually in some of the highest performing education systems, where we know how important parental involvement in children's education is, actually in some of those systems, parents are not helping their children, particularly with their education. And again, when you start to break it out into actual number of hours spent, the average Indian parent claims to spend 12 hours a week helping their children with their homework or with their work after school. Again, look at old Europe down at the bottom there. Finland, United Kingdom, France, Estonia, Spain, Germany, much, much less likely than the global average to be helping their parents to be helping their children with their education. And then we actually asked not just how much time do you spend, but do you think it's enough? And what's interesting is that in some of the countries where the parents are spending the most time, they also don't think they're spending enough. So again, in some of the emerging markets here, you see large numbers of parents spending large numbers of time with their children and still saying it's not enough. Whereas again, look right down at the bottom. Germany, Spain, Russia, Italy, France. Countries who, on the previous slide, are not spending that much, are also the least likely to say that that's a problem. So you're starting to see a real discrepancy here regionally between parents who think that it's important to spend time with their children and parents who don't think it is. This breaks it down by phase of how old your child is. Perhaps unsurprisingly, what you find is the older the child, the less likely you are to spend that much time with them, probably because you don't know necessarily why you think that is true. And again, we asked parents, and if you don't think you spend enough time, why don't you think you spend enough time? And the top answer by a long, long way was that parents don't think they have enough time. Interestingly, again, if we go back to the point about do they think the school system's good enough, they already receive another support. I don't think that it's my job. I think it's fine. I think the school does it. These are relatively common answers that come out amongst the top-performing education systems. But what we find here is that a lot of parents, almost regardless of age, regardless of social class, are saying that they don't necessarily have enough time to help their children with their education. And here you can see it. You can see the answers broken down by educational level of the parent. And you can see there are massive discrepancy within the shortage of time too busy between graduate parents, those that graduated high school, and those that left at primary level education. The more educated your parents are, by which we assume from this, although we don't know, we assume from this they work higher paying, higher status jobs with longer hours. We assume from this, or we don't know, that they work longer hours and they have longer travelling time. They are much, much more likely to say that they have less time to spend to help with. And again, conversely, if you look at the don't feel well educated enough, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you only left with a primary level education yourself and you're now a parent, you're much, much less likely to feel qualified to help. Okay. We asked parents, if it was affordable and there was a place nearby, would you send your child to a fee-paying school? Again, let's remember the distinction here between countries in which fee-paying is very, very common via low-cost private schools and ones where it's not. And what we see that actually by a sort of 50%, 55% to 40%, parents would send their children to a fee-paying school. Again, look at the top of that chart there. Emerging economies where there is already a large proportion of low-cost private school provision, India, Kenya, Turkey, South Africa, parents, unsurprisingly, we know this, we know empirically they are sending their children to private fee-paying provision. Down at the bottom, again, more of your sort of G7 old Europe type countries. But I think the Finland one is quite an interesting example as well, because yes, it's second from bottom, but actually Finland, 29% of Finnish parents, almost 1 in 3, would actually quite happily send their children to a private school, despite the fact that there are no fee-paying schools in Finland at the moment. So what you've got here is a level of dissatisfaction, even in a very, very high-performing PISA country, where 1 in 3 parents are showing willingness to send their child to a private school. Once you break it down, again, you see this big discrepancy starting to emerge by age and by education level of the parent. And on the whole, if you are younger as a parent and or if you are more educated, you are more open to education pluralism. So if you as a parent are a graduate, by 60 to 36%, you are happy to contemplate sending your child to a fee-paying school. If you're an 18 to 34-year-old parent, again, by 66 to 30, you are likely to contemplate it. Whereas if you're 45 plus, 47. Again, we're assuming here that they can afford it. We're assuming there's a place available. This question is just getting at principled support or principled objection for it. And it's quite a staggering shift just by age of parent. If a place was essentially handed to you on a plate, would you take it? And older parents say no, and younger parents say yes. More educated parents say yes, less educated parents say no. We asked a similar question where we attempted to get under the skin of vouchers and PPPs, and again, this shows a similar thing. We show a very, very high level of approval for the principle of vouchers. So again, you're sort of trying to get at the private school question here again, but in a slightly different way. So rather than an actual private school, we're talking about a voucher here paid for by the government. Again, you see a very, very similar thing in countries where they are very, very common with voucher and PPPs. Kenya, India, South Africa, you see a big level of parental support for it. Down at the bottom, in Europe, in countries where this is less familiar, you see a much more skepticism of the principle of vouchers and PPPs. Again, though, look at the difference in split. Look at the extent to which it changes by the education level of parent and by parental age. So 68% of younger parents will contemplate this, but only 55% of older parents would contemplate it. Interestingly, 13% of parents who are currently sending their child to a fee-paying school don't like the idea of the government paying for their child to go to a fee-paying school. I have no understanding or no explanation for that data point. Then we asked not just about private schools or about PPPs, but we asked about various different institutions running free-to-attend schools. So as opposed to the government running schools in your country, what do you think about various other institutions running schools in your country? And we asked specifically about charities, parent groups, teachers, private companies, and religious institutions. And you can see here that for all of them, particularly for teachers, and least so for religious institutions, parents are quite willing to open up to pluralism. So these are free-to-attend schools that are nevertheless run not by the government, but run by somebody under contract to the government. And you see there, but by a quite big majority across all 5 of these groups, parents are willing to talk to all of those people. Again, once you start to break this down now, we have groups of teachers running schools. This is the most popular answer by far, and you can see that with the exception of Japan and Italy, Germany and Peru, a majority of parents say they are willing or they approve of the principle of groups of teachers running schools that they would send their children to. Same question when we look at parent groups. Again, some very, very high scores coming up here. Again, Japan, right at the bottom there. Japan has a very, very strong skepticism of anyone other than the state running schools. UK towards the bottom here, that has quite a lot of skepticism. Again, look at Italy, look at Germany. Again, you've got a sort of cluster of Europe down at the bottom there. At the top, unsurprisingly, emerging markets who have got a pluralist education system, much more willing. Charities, again, similar picture. UK, France, Germany, Spain, right at the bottom. Emerging markets right at the top. Private companies is an interesting one. Again, you might expect there to be more hostility to the principle of private companies, and it scores a little bit lower overall as a global average, but not as much as we were hypothesizing it would do. Again, you see there countries where they do have private companies running schools scoring quite highly. You see Europe at the bottom and the UK right at the bottom there in terms of willingness to contemplate private companies running free-to-attend schools. And then we asked about religious institutions. Again, what you see here, unsurprisingly, is a correlation with highly religious societies and societies in which religious institutions do run a lot of informal education provision. Again, right down at the bottom, same group of countries there, not showing a willingness to have religious groups involved in running free-to-attend schools. Breaking it down by age, again, you look at the difference here. If you are a younger parent, you are more willing to adopt the principle of pluralism. You are more willing to have any of these groups of people run schools if you are a younger parent compared to if you're an older parent. And it's a consistent skew by category of age across every single criteria. And we saw that again if we think back to previous ones where we broke it down by age. Younger parents, more educated parents, which is on the next slide, again, much more willing to contemplate pluralism. And then lastly, we asked parents what they thought about the future, and this was one of the ones that Vikas pulled out in his opening plenary this morning. I was quite smug about this answer because I hypothesised that this would be the answer, and everyone else in the foundation said it wouldn't be. We asked parents whether they thought their children's school was preparing them for the future, and I said parents will say yes, and everyone else said no, they won't. And parents said yes by a 2-to-1 majority. Actually, they do think that schools are preparing their children for the future, which is not the common theme you have in conferences like this. It's not the common theme you get from policymakers. It's not the common theme that you get from a lot of vested interests talking about various products which they think school systems should buy. You do get a lot of concern that schools are not preparing children for the future. This suggests, and it's only one data point, but it suggests actually that parents are reasonably confident. When we ask them, if you're not confident, what more should it be done? This is where you start to get, again, some of the answers that you might expect. So we do have a kind of focus on careers and jobs and skills for the future. There is a focus on curriculum. There is a focus on technology. You might expect these to be the answers that come up, and indeed they do. So when parents say, no, I don't think it is preparing them for the future, we do find that the kind of common answers that tend to dominate the conference circuit come up here. But I do come back to that first point again. This is just in the 2/3 of parents, so the 1/3 of parents that think their schools aren't preparing them for the future. Actually, when you look here, most parents do. And this correlates with the fact that most parents are very, very optimistic about their child's future. Now, that's not to be complacent. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of issues in global education. In fact, you could argue that this is wildly over-optimistic, given everything we know about the data, about global education, everything we know about the learning crisis, everything we know about the crippling shortage of teachers, everything we know about the hundreds of millions of children in school unable to access basic skills, given everything we know about the inability to focus on early maths and early reading in too many school systems. I would argue this is much, much too complacent a figure. But it is staggering that by 60 to 13%, parents are optimistic about their children's future. And it's good. It's nice. Parents should be optimistic about their child's future. As policymakers, we ought to think about, is that is justified optimism? But parents are hugely, hugely optimistic about the future. What are they worried about? They're worried about the things you'd expect them to be worried about. They're worried about whether their children are happy. They're worried about whether their children are being bullied. They're worried about their personal safety. These are things which you would expect them to worry about, and indeed they do worry about. And again, when you ask them, what are you worried about for your child's future? You see a real skew between what you can call the sort of micro bread and butter type issues and the macro global issues. And parents, unsurprisingly perhaps, are really, really focused on the bread and butter. They want their children to grow up, to get jobs, to have enough money, and to look after themselves. They don't tend to worry so much about abstract issues like terrorism, like climate change. They're cognizant of them, but actually when it comes to their children, parents want their children to be happy, they want them to have a house, they want them to have a job, they want them to have enough money, and they want them to be settled. And that's what they want for their children. And then the very last question we asked them was, given all of this, Given the mass expansion of tertiary education in many countries around the world, given the mass pressure to make fee-free tertiary education in many countries around the world, despite the undoubted socioeconomic skew that that leads to, do you think it is important that your child goes to university? And actually, 65% do. But look at some of the figures down there at the bottom. Look at some of the figures there in again, going back to old Europe. Actually, only 32% of French parents, 32% of UK parents, 35% of German parents think it's important that their child goes to university. Whereas at the top, the systems where we know, if you go back to all the previous data points, the systems where the parents are working hard, the systems where they know that the children need to improve, the systems where they're contemplating different provision, those are the countries which by massive, massive margins are saying they want their children to go to university. So if, and it is an if tertiary education is something that leads to personal advancement and social advancement, you might see here a change over the next 10, 20 years, where particularly you can see in emerging markets, in Asia, in Latin America, a huge skew, a huge pressure for mass tertiary expansion. And actually in Europe, not so much. Again, this raises really, really important policy consequences for policymakers. Is it, for example, a good use of tertiary funding to have fee-free tertiary education if there is not much demand from parents for children to go to university? There's been discussions earlier this morning about the growth of vocational and technical education. Actually, is this answer reflecting the fact that some parents are rationally saying that they want a more technical education for their children or not? Again, we don't know. But it's fascinating to see the regional skew here between Europe, which has traditionally sent the highest proportion of children to university, actually parents now saying we're not that bothered. And emerging markets, who are hot on the heels, who are very, very keen on the education to improving their system, saying by massive, massive majorities that they do want their children to go to university. So that's the end of the presentation. There's an awful lot in there, and I'm conscious that I skipped through it very, very quickly. Very happy to open it up for questions. I should give you a slight warning that my answer to a lot of them will be, I don't know why people said that, because we didn't follow up on it, but I'm very happy to speculate, and if it's good speculation, I'll take it and I'll claim it as my own next time I do this presentation. Thank you very much.
As to what constitutes quality education, some of the indicators. And I might comment also on this issue that you said parents who want to, if there's free paying institutions, they want to pay, they rather want to pay themselves, and you don't know the answer. I can speculate maybe they want to feel proud they paid for their own children's education, rather than somebody paying for the education. So that might be the reason why parents who want to choose paying their own children's school fees rather than letting the government pay for it. But my first question still stands that what are the indicators of quality education that you've maybe come across?
So a very good question and a very informed piece of speculation, which I will pinch. In terms of what we use, so when we deliberately didn't define quality education in the survey, we deliberately didn't want parents to be guided. So we simply asked them, use your own definition. Do you think your child has a good education? Do you think the schools in your country are good? And we left it entirely up to them how they would define that. We used the PISA scores as a kind of flawed proxy just for an interesting point. I wouldn't put any more weight on them than that. I certainly wouldn't correlate them across. But we use it as that because simply you've got to have an empirical data point, and that's got the bigger sample size. We could have put Pearl's or Tim's data up there, but it's the biggest kind of cross-country comparison there is. But it's a very good point to make, which is actually, and this is a point I made about some emerging markets, we know, and I think Susanna from ARC is in the room, made this point, we know in some of the emerging markets that actually the children aren't getting a quality education, because we know from the survey data where we ask children how many can read at a grade appropriate level, we know that lots of them can't. And we know that that hasn't changed for the last 10 years in countries like India, for example. So actually Indian parents are saying they think their children is getting a good education. Arguably, the actual empirical data is telling you exactly the opposite. So I think it has no more weight on it than the weight that should be given to anything where a large constituency of people think that. Because if you are, one of the reasons this is really interesting to us is because we as a foundation are increasingly interested in the political economy of reform, how you make education happen, how you make reform happen on a systemic level, and how you make it stick. And that can't happen without government engagement. And one of the things we're trying to understand under here is what motivates governments, and in part that's what parents think as their voters. So we think it is important what parents think, whether it is true or not, because that will affect what they want from their governments.
People may speculate on good education because of the good examination results they get. But is that what should be used for defining good quality education? Because you realize that people may be getting very good marks in examinations, but how are they performing in life, society? Is there any correlation between your good marks in examinations in the school and then how you perform actually on the job in the market? So what's good quality education? I think that's a very big issue that we must, carefully, unravel.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, the distinction between your cognitive ability as measured by the exams results you get and your success in life in the labour market or in various other indicators is a hugely contested issue. And there's absolute books and books and books of literature written on it, and I'm not going to attempt to summarise that now. But you're right, it's not just simple enough to say a good education equals high exam scores and that's all that matters. I would make the point that in most of the survey data that I'm familiar with, it does show a pretty high correlation between high cognitive scores and success in various other areas of life, including other non-cognitive areas, including things like better health, including things like lower criminality, including things like higher, greater levels of civic engagement. So I would be cautious about extending an argument that says it doesn't matter what children's exam grades are. But you're right, this survey doesn't attempt to do that. This survey simply says, your definition of quality, do you think your children are getting it, yes or no?
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Lynn Kobayashi from Japan. Could you pull up the, second last slide where it asked parents whether they're optimistic or pessimistic about their their children's future? Yeah, Japan is at the very bottom, which I'm proud of. And then when you add up 14 and 28, you don't even get to 50. Where's the rest of the people?
Oh, that's neither. It's the big chunk in the middle. Yeah.
And that's the majority.
Yeah.
It's very Japanese. Thank you. Just
I mean, it's an interesting point though, because actually, South Korea and Japan, which were the two sort of Southeast Asian countries which we polled here, which again, with all due limitations of PISA, et cetera, are two of the highest performing education systems in the world, consistently rank amongst the bottom here. And actually, we found that similarly when we did another survey that list last year called Generation Z, which is 16 to 24-year-olds. And again, we polled a similar number of young people from a similar number of countries in the world, and we asked them how optimistic they were about the future. And again, Japan and South Korea came rock bottom in almost all of these criteria. So South Korean and Japanese parents, despite having empirically a very, very highly successful education system, are pretty miserable, think it's not very good, aren't very optimistic about the future, and don't really know what to do about it. So, you can take that one or two ways. You can either say, well, this just shows the limitation of this as a survey design, because actually they're doing incredibly well. Or you can say, watch out for PISA 2030, when it turns out that Japan and South Korea won't quite be so high up anymore. So it is really, really interesting, this sort of almost kind of existential crisis that you do see consistently in our survey data, are particularly around Japan and South Korea, where instances like mental health are fairly well known as being problematic, but not even kind of significantly diagnosable mental health, just general angst, for want of a better word, amongst parents and amongst young people in Southeast Asia really, really comes out starkly across a whole number of indicators we've used. Yes, lady down front.
It's a speculation.
Oh, I like that.
Those countries very happy, where parents are very happy with the educational system, although it's not moving forward, compared to those other countries where people are not happy, although they're at the top. It seems like with those high expectations for improvement is actually the engine for improvement, for continuous improvement. So when you're not happy, you keep moving towards improvement. And when you're happy, because you don't know any better, you don't become any better. It's like that vicious circle. And then, of course, with those high expectations comes the not so well-being, but then performance, just a speculation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good one.
I just want to touch on something concerning the vouchers. I've been in a country earlier with the voucher system and why some parents do not like that voucher system. Perhaps two things to think about. One of them is the indirect cost that is associated with those vouchers. So parents are going to end up paying for those vouchers. And then some well-off parents think that their others deserve it more than them. So if I do not really need it, let it for the others. So just a thought again.
Yeah, no, which country were you in just experiencing that recently?
Qatar.
Right.
Hello, Masa from Jordan. There is a great contradiction between we as educators see where the educational system is or standing today, and you mentioned that. But I see a great conflict between this result. This is a very optimistic result. This means the education system is on the right track for parents around the world. Or this is what I've read from the data, if I'm not mistaken. So how do you find this contradiction? Like, if I would read the report as not being an educator, I would say the educational system around the world is doing brilliant job. Assume to do that. Yeah. So how would you do that?
So just make sure I understand you. So you're saying, so the survey data here suggests that all education systems are doing very well, but you think it's under attack? Who do you think it's under attack from? Sorry, if I understand you right.
No, it's not under attack. I mean, if I read the report, I would say the education system is doing very well around the world. I couldn't do any other conclusion.
Yes.
Got it? So it conflicts completely with us as educators, saying that we're not really catering well for the students in different countries around the world, here, globally. So if I would read this report, how would you tell me that this is not, I don't know, it doesn't make sense.
So
I know it's data,
yeah.
but...
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point you raise. And again, I think, so some people would argue that this shows the limitation of asking relatively uninformed people about a quality judgment, which is very difficult to make. And I think there is some truth in that. Some people would say the contrary, that actually those of us who are too involved in a system sometimes focus too much on the problems and actually don't always take a step back and look at the growth. And I think there is some merit in both of those arguments. It is not uncommon to have this kind of clash between what, I don't want to use experts, but experts in a field think and what less expert people in a field think. I'm very uncomfortable with using that language because it suggests a prejudicial judgment, and I'm deliberately not trying to make one. But it is not uncommon to have people who are very closely involved in a field reach a different conclusion than people who are slightly more removed from a field. The reason why it is important, as I said a minute ago, is in a sense, from a point about political economy of reform, it doesn't matter whether the parents are right or wrong, because parents' views will drive policy choices. So actually, if you are an educator, or you are somebody who is involved in education policy, or you're in an NGO or civil society, it matters what parents think about education reform. Because if you are trying to execute education reform, you need to be aware of what the biggest constituency in that country thinks. And actually, if parents do think that the education system is improving rapidly, and you as a civil society organisation are trying to argue something differently, you need to be conscious of the fact that politicians may take comfort in the fact that the majority of their voters think that the system is high-performing. Yes, Harry at the back.
Hi, Jonathan. Scott from Interpiece. Good to see you, and I hope we can get access to the PowerPoint afterwards as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's already on our website.
I wanted to ask a question. I think there's probably interesting data as well to look at in terms of how much people actually trust their government generally. And then how much do they trust the educational system managed by that government? I mean,
I wish we'd asked that question.
I know, I'm sorry, but I think it's nevertheless a big part of it. And because even in conflict countries that I work in, for example, where the government is either non-existent in people's lives or very weak or mistrusted, people actually, parents, want to invest even more in education for their kids because the government's not going to be doing it. In other places, they might believe that it's exactly what their kid needs that the government's providing, and they want to be part of that journey. But the universal thing, the beautiful universal thing, is that globally, every country that I've worked in, parents want their kids to live a better life than they did. So they're going to invest if they feel that it needs to be propped up, or if it doesn't, because it's good already. And so that's why this is difficult to unpack the data, let's say, from that point of view of trust in the system. in terms of how much time they put into it, etc. The other question I wanted to emphasize what the gentleman who asked the first question said, is that often it's the informal skills, emotional intelligence, which actually makes you more viable in the workplace than some of your technical skills, let's say. And did any of that come through in the data points about how much people think that the education system actually develops a well-rounded child or future citizen versus one that is une tête bien pleine, as we say in French, with a full knowledge?
Yeah. So the chart I've just put back up on the screen there, so the yellow bars are for parents who think that there needs to be what we call greater focus on non-traditional or softer skills. So you can see this does score in most countries pretty highly. The reason these bars don't all add up is that people can give multiple answers. But yes, that answer does come up reasonably highly. People tend to think that if you don't think your school is doing well for your children, you are likely to think that it's because of kind of an absence of those skills. And again, that is in some part a rational judgment that, you know, there is evidence about the kind of the emerging use or the emerging kind of function of these non-cognitive skills and its kind of correlation with labour success in the labour market. Again, we can have a discussion which is much wider, is about how best schools do develop those skills and actually whether there is a distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive skills, and actually whether those sort of softer skills are actually domain-specific and actually best taught through a kind of traditional education. But that's a whole different type of thing which we haven't surveyed on, so I'm not going to speculate on that anymore. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in that slide about parental choice to higher education. I thought I'd share something that came up in a session we had in the boardroom earlier, which is about the difference between signal and skill. Sort of speculation that the signals in the technical education system are perhaps clearer where that technical education system is more embedded, whereas higher education offers a clearer signal to people, despite the fact that it may actually be the wrong signal. And my colleague from India, who was on the panel in the boardroom, pointed out that there are parts of India where you can go and do a short course and become a taxi driver and earn 5 times as much as you would if you got a standard bachelor's degree from a local higher education institution, which I think puts a lot of premium back on the fact that parents are deeply supportive, and that I absolutely recognise the goals that you've set out that parents have for education, but parental careers advice is often 30 years out of date. So I suppose I should have a question here. I suppose the question is, how can we use some of the data that we're starting to get? You know, you look at something like, in the UK, we have data on which apprenticeships pay more and which pay less, to help parents understand the choice that we're always going to end up asking them and their children to make at 16 or 18 or 21.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and you know, if we had £1 for every conference panel that you and I have been on where we've talked about the kind of dearth of technical education and why it is that parents don't respond to labour market signals, you know, we'd be the ones giving away the $1 million prize. I think you're right, essentially, in a nutshell. I think there is, for better or worse, university does tend to have a very, very high labour market signalling. It does tend to attract, in most countries, a pretty significant labour market premium, and as such, it is probably logical. Not least, it doesn't harm in many countries, harm your wage potential. It is logical to take it as opposed to a kind of technical qualification, which often doesn't give you that labour market return, even if it might be a better thing for you to do, in inverted commas. Ultimately, I mean, the thing I've never really understood about technical education is why, if there's just a kind of total skill shortage in so many occupations, that isn't reflected in kind of wage gains. You know, why is it that almost every employer that you ever meet will say that they suffer a massive shortage of technical skills, and you ask them if they've ever considered raising the wages to encourage people into it, and they've all said no, and they think the government should do it. And, you know, well, I mean, why not? I'd like a pony as well. But you have to, at some point, kind of put your money where your mouth is, and if you think there's a technical skill, you have to recognise it in your wage gain. And university, for better or worse, does often do that. And if more technical qualifications did that, then I think that would naturally sort of start to see to use a plumbing analogy, you'd start to see the taps turn on.
Well, coming back on that, in your chart, potentially the countries where that is beginning to happen, or in the case of, for instance, Germany, if I'm going to be stereotypical about talking about technical education, that's where those things do happen.
That is true. They do often have a more developed technical education system, but they also send globally, looking at that globe of 29 countries, they are also the people that send a much higher proportion of young people to university than the countries at the top of that chart.
The data is showing parents as being very positive, and yet, as you say, those that are in the field who maybe have possibly more knowledge or not, depending on how you see it, maybe are looking from the other point of view. Isn't there a sort of an elephant in the room here that suggests that maybe we need to provide parents with a continual education, if I could call that? We talk about CPD in our roles as educators. Do we need that for parents so that when they are with their children and talking about their futures, that they're able to be more informative in what they're sharing with their children as well?
So I can totally see the logic of that argument. The reason I'm skeptical is because I'm skeptical of the efficacy of any such program.
Can I just come in? So,
Yeah,
but
please.
we have parent-teacher evenings, don't we? And all that
Yeah.
seems to happen in parent-teacher evenings, when I think back to my son, which was a little while ago, but I'd go along that, and it was all about, you know, the targets. Was he going to hit his target? Was he going to get his 10 A stars or whatever? But nobody really talked about why he was getting his 10 A stars beyond getting into university. Well, isn't education about what happens outside the classroom, not inside the classroom? And can we do something to maybe help parents to start to view education differently?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you about that. I think when the existing routes between parents and schools are dominated by accountability metrics shared with parents as opposed to kind of their children's development, then that's a flawed system. Accountability metrics are between the schools and the people who kind of regulate them rather than schools and parents. A conversation between a teacher and a parent at a parent-teacher evening should be about your child's performance, his or her progress, why it's important, what it is that they like, what it is that they don't like, and so on. So yes, to that extent, I completely agree with you that actually we should be having the right conversations with parents rather than the wrong conversations with them.
Sorry, really quick question around the homework aspect. I'm guessing that was generally homework, so it wasn't split by subject, say? Because obviously the findings that you got from the parents is lack of time rather than lack of knowledge, although that came in slightly high, was it? Do you know specifically if there are any subjects that suffer more than others?
So we deliberately didn't ask, and in fact we deliberately didn't use the homework word because we wanted parents, particularly in different countries, who often kind of, for example, helping run informal education, supplementary schooling, potentially even just taking your children to and from school. We wanted all of that to count. Now it got shortened in all of the media to homework, but actually we don't know if it is homework or more, but we certainly don't know, as you say, whether it's easier or not for parents to help with a modern foreign language or maths versus science or humanities. We don't know. Oh, last question at the back, yeah.
Question, are there any prior studies to benchmark this against to determine if there's been a change over some period of time?
So there are a couple of other parent surveys out there. One of them by a major high street bank that was based out of Hong Kong and Shanghai. But yeah, without being kind of pedantic about it, it doesn't allow you to kind of track because you're not asking the same group and you're not asking exactly the same questions and you don't have exactly the same controls. So you can sort of look at two surveys and you can say, well, to the extent that they ask the same question, or a similar question, you might think that it's getting better or worse. But no, the short answer is no. One of the things we would like to do is we would like to rerun the survey with exactly the same questions in exactly the same countries 5 years later on, and that would give us some sense, just as we've done with our Global Teacher Stata Index, which is coming out later this year. That would give us some sense of trend, but again, it'll still be only 2 data points.
Yeah, I think that's probably really helpful. And then hearing kind of I think the purpose I heard of the study is to understand is policymakers are looking at changing education to get the parents' opinion because they're the voters, make that happen. So clearly, from the education community, you're hearing it's broken. You ask employers, and as you said, that young people aren't graduating with either the hard skills or the soft skills. So I wonder, have you all given any thought I mean, so how do you approach this now? I mean, you would hope parents would have hope for their kids in the future. And you hate to come at them and say, look, you may have great hope here, but your kids are going to suffer a terrible fate. So from a policy standpoint, any recommendations on an approach to take?
It's a great question because, as you say, for us as a foundation that's advocating improving the status and capacity of teachers, on the one hand, you know, you could say job done, everyone loves teachers, we can all go home. On the other hand, you can say, actually, you know what, a lot of empirical data suggests that a lot of teachers are not where they need to be. Actually, parents are wildly optimistic. And it is a very, very difficult point to make because, as you say, you know, if you think it's bad sort of going to a parent-teacher evening and talking about your child's target grades, imagine going, oh, you think your child's doing really well? Oh, have you got a lot to learn? So I don't have a good answer for you, and it's something we're going to be thinking quite a lot about as a foundation over the next year or so, because actually I think it's about building the coalition. And it's about building a coalition that say, you know what, parents are quite interested in this, they are optimistic, they think there's potential. We think there are areas where we need to work with them to kind of tackle the issues which we know that other data suggests there is an issue. But on the whole, to be honest, one of the biggest problems that I think we face in global education at the moment is that governments are losing interest in education. It's falling down the agenda in terms of aid spending. It's falling down the agenda in terms of political priority. The GPE replenishment was, you know, a reasonable amount of marker, but compared to some of the international aid being spent on health, for example, on climate change, even civil society, education risks falling down the agenda. And I think if we could do one thing as a foundation and one thing out of this conference, it would be reasserting the importance of everyone, philanthropic money, government money, private money, focusing on actually the need for sufficient funding so that parents can be happy justifiably in years to come. And on that optimistic note, I will leave it there. Thank you very much.